Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business here at Lancaster University Management School. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bebbington.
Jan, I want to talk to you today about what the difference is between good and bad.
Well, I would like to know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'm not just talking about in life generally. I'd like to think you know when you're being good and when you're being bad. Santa Claus certainly does if you don't.
That's true. So in what way are we going to talk about good and bad then?
We're going to talk about something called good dividends. And for a start, we're going to learn what a good dividend is, because if we don't, then we'll be talking about something that we haven't got a clue necessarily what it means, first of all. Our guest today is Professor Steve Kempster. He's an emeritus professor. What it essentially means is he retired but decided to keep on working, which strikes me as being particularly weird, but that's it. He's so he's an emeritus professor here in the Entrepreneurship and Strategy Department in Lancaster University Management School. He's an expert on leadership, and he will be talking to us all about good dividends, which is essentially something that Steve and his team have developed. Welcome, Steve.
It's lovely to be here.
So let's just dive straight on in then, because as an accountant, I think I know what a dividend is. And from our world, a dividend is what a company pays to its owners out of its accumulated profits. But I think that you're talking about dividends in quite a different way. So tell me, what is the traditional idea of dividends and what is the idea of good dividends? And are there different kinds of dividends?
Well, I guess they are different kinds of dividends. But first, I've got to say, as Paul introduced, that I'm a leadership scholar. So why am I even talking about profit and dividends? So I've had to travel quite a bit of a journey to learn, A, what a dividend is, and then B, what a good dividend might be. And so we'll get on to the difference, I guess, immediately. So a dividend, just as you described, is the distribution of an amount of profit, just as I think you kicked off with, Jan. But a better way, I think, of understanding dividends, certainly for the way we look at good dividends, is to see it as a return or a flow, something that comes out from, in this case, financial capital. So if you invest X amount of money, you anticipate getting a return or something to come from that. And so you got financial capital, which we tend to always think of when we say dividends. And quite deliberately, we wanted to sort of go with the grain of capitalism. So why don't we use good dividends to explore the whole of this topic? But without distracting too much in your intro, as you were talking about what's the difference between good and bad, I think our friend Aristotle might have something to say to it. And in the original ideas that we were exploring, we started with virtuous dividends. But one of my close colleagues took quite an offence to the word virtuous for a whole different set of issues, which is not for this podcast. And so we then explored what really is going on, just like you did the intro between good and bad. What would good dividends look like? And therefore, how does that, in a sort of fundamental human good versus bad aspect, flow out? So anyway, to get back to the central argument, now I've addressed what's the difference between good and bad. A good dividend is that flows from one aspect of capital to another. And so the idea of good dividends is, instead of just seeing the purpose of business is to accumulate greater financial capital, the idea being that the purpose of business is to have a set of interconnected capital. So financial capital, I think we probably broadly understand. Then we've got human capital, often referred to as the most important asset of a business. That's the set of employees, or their talent, skills, knowledge, aspirations, hopes. If we can get those talents and hopes and energy all fused together, what dividend flows from that? So now we've got human capital, financial capital in the room. So then we think, so we got human capital now cooking on gas, everybody's engaged. What is the dividend? What is the flow that we get out from that capital? So now we'd be looking at greater innovation, greater sense of ideas. We're going to get greater productivity. So we're looking at operational capital. So operational capital simply is, how does an organization do what it does? Some do it better, some do it worse. So we got operational capital in the room. If we've got productivity and quality enhanced and customer service, Typically, research shows that reputational capital, the brand of an organization, is enhanced. The flow from operational capital goes into reputational capital. If an organization is deeply respected, customers deeply value what's been offered, then we see an incredibly strong correlation between greater productivity and quality and greater reputation and brand flows into financial capital so we can reinvest. So that's 5 capitals: the innovation, operation, human, financial, and reputation. The critical one for the whole good dividends argument is how does planet and community fit in? So the notion of natural capital as the environment alongside community capital, how do those fuse together and fit into these other capitals? And so the final point is turning into a sort of 101 lecture here. My apologies. But the final
take
point...
your notes, Jan. Have you got your notes there? Yeah.
I can see her just scribbling something down. But the final point is if planet and community can be embedded in the business model as part of the system, how do the benefits of investing in the community or investing, at least not to harm the environment, but hopefully enhancing the environment, how does that flow throughout business value? How do we connect social value to business value? And the research we've done and the work we've now with over 100 businesses is that there's a very, very explicit and obvious business value relationship of investing into the environment, investing into communities that flows into, for example, human capital, flows into reputational capital, things that we sort of know well about, but that gives you all these dividends. Glue them all together in what we broadly explore, which is a systems approach. So all of them provide value to each other. They flow around, that each are enhancing the other, including planet and community, and we have a whole set of good dividends.
And I hesitate to use this phrase given what you've just said, but that sounds like a virtuous cycle in terms of that really reinforces with each other. Does it always run as smoothly as that? Or is there on occasions that the idea that if you enhance all of these capitals, you in the long run enhance financial capital and it allows you to enhance the other, does that ever get sticky or not sort of run as smoothly as you'd like?
I don't think any of it runs smoothly. But then again, most businesses don't run smoothly. They have all sorts of sticky problems attached. So on the one hand, we might think there's an ideal model, which is the current model, and what I'm suggesting is a problem, sticky, tricky way of trying to adapt this. I would say that the biggest challenge is not so much people understanding that I've just described. In fact, my son, he's a biologist, did his PhD here at our university in the Environment Centre. He said, what I'm outlining is surely obvious common sense. Bit like your virtuous cycle. Why doesn't every business maximize its capitals? Why would it not purposefully pursue increasing value and connecting them all together? He's a biologist, so he looks at ecosystems, he deeply understands that world, so that's his mental perspective. And I think it's that, if I can segue into the biggest challenge, is that it's a mindset shift we're talking about here. If the purpose of business is profit, it's all residual down to the bottom line. And in fact, in the management school, in most business schools, we're complicit in all the models we produce, that the whole purpose of business is profit and everything goes to that residual outline. If you think about it in a different way, which is what we're trying to suggest in the good dividends, is seeing business as a systemic flow of capitals that all interconnect. You keep reinvesting and enhancing all of them, including planet, community. Then we have a different perspective. But I have to say, I've been working on this for 4, 5, 6 years now, way over 100 businesses I've explored, probably more like 200, 300 I've spoken to at different events. The biggest challenge is the mindset, is to shift to a different way of understanding business. It's not the ideas. The technical bits are really straightforward. Perhaps systems thinking is a slight stretch, but technically it's not difficult at all. The issue is a mindset shift.
So you've got this belief in a responsible approach that's at the core of all of this. But you said that it does actually enhance financial returns, because you talked there about the importance regarding finances and financial returns. It does enhance financial returns, but in the long run. So I guess that becomes the question of how long is the long run that these companies might have to wait before they see the financial returns for these more responsible capital investments?
Yeah. I think the received wisdom, it takes the medium to long term for a purpose-led orientation. And something I haven't spoken yet about is the purpose-led part. So we might come back to that. But let me just address your direct question about the short, medium and long term. So I expected this whole argument just to be persuading people to sacrifice in the short term for a greater medium to long term benefit. And I stuck with that in most conversations. And then over the last 3 years, I've been working with Cotswold Dairy, based down in Tewkesbury. I think they're the largest family dairy in the UK. I could have that completely wrong, by the way. But they're pretty big, about 500-ish employees, family business. They've explored the good dividends ideas and have taken a significant mindset shift and have embedded it pretty comprehensively. Anyway, in chatting to the CEO and the ops director, particularly the ops director, Justin, they wanted to try out embedding community into the heart of their business. So their purpose is to be at the heart of a responsible and regenerative dairy community. I mean, in just saying a dairy community is a challenge in itself. I mean, the methane that's being produced is one of the most critical issues, isn't it, that we have to deal with and deal with pretty quickly. So how on earth would a dairy and its related partners be able to do a regenerative approach to its community? So what they decided to tackle immediately was a business aspect. Their business challenge was churn, was attrition, labour shortage, and having major issues of having to go through agencies to recruit people to stay in. And if you've got big churn, you've got big productivity issues, you've got issues of people's motivation and understanding and commitment, and all those flow through, and it's a pretty unproductive place if you've got high churn and attrition. So exploring some of these ideas, they thought, well, let's take up a partnership with the local prison. So let's bring in some people who are about to be released from prison. And how can we get them working alongside and getting work experience? Because there's enormous social benefit to society if you can create prisoners straight into the workforce rather than back onto the social cost of the state. So if we could tackle that, would that have the impact that I was saying about flow around increasing issues in the workplace? The bottom line, so I'm going to get to your point now. I had that look on your eyebrows there.
No.
Cut to the chase. So the bottom line was within a year and a half, they've increased employee engagement. They've increased productivity. They've been measuring this from the outset. They had explicit measures at the outset and they followed it through. Higher employee engagement, higher productivity, less waste, significantly lower levels of attrition, reduced their agency costs to in excess of $250,000 in the space of 18 months. Mm-hmm. So as one organisation, 500 plus employees, addressed some fundamental business issues by engaging with social value, they've gone straight to the bottom line and they can demonstrate immediate return. They've now grown that. They're now working with addiction charities and all sorts of other places to work with people inside the business. It's an even bigger story, but your eyebrows tell me we don't have the time.
I didn't realise my eyebrows were so expressive. I was just sat here looking at Steve, fascinated by what he was saying, but my eyebrows were obviously dancing a funny jig.
They were indeed, I mean that's just such an exciting example and huge build of social capital and people's lives transformed. And my ears pricked up because you said this was a family firm. In your experience, are the family-owned firms more likely to grasp this mindset change in the good dividends model, or could it be for any kind of firm?
I think it's a really, really good point. If I was to think of the organisations that have really grasped it quickly and readily, it is family firms. There's a sense of generations being utterly committed, connected to space, to place. And a greater sense of purpose, not necessarily an explicit purpose, but an implicit purpose of wishing to be here for the next generations and the subsequent generations. We're going to always be part, and we recruit from these communities we're utterly engaged with it. So I think there is something in that, Jan, that does happen. But equally, there's a firm just down the road, Forsberg, Chris Main, he's been working on these ideas. And that's a private business. Originally, it was created by Mr. Forsberg, clues, I guess, in the name, but now it's a standalone private business, and it has grown considerably. He embraced these ideas because he travelled through a learning journey. He worked for a series of programs here in the management school, and I think he's opened his mind, eyes, everything to the possibilities of a different way business could be run and the benefits that could flow.
Are there businesses in certain sectors that are more willing to consider the good dividends process? Are there areas of operations that it maybe is more applicable to that you found?
Not yet. So I would say the relatively deep relationships with 100 plus, they're across all sectors. Mm-hmm. All sectors. We've got a tool called the SDG Configurator, Sustainable Development Goals Configurator. Yeah. So I think it's been taken by 220, 230 is the latest data. All SDGs are covered. Mm-hmm. All SDGs are covered by those businesses. The point of the tool is to align. So the critical bit about the good dividends is how do you identify social value that resonates deeply with the business? Mm-hmm. So not just philanthropy of gifting to buy some more rugby shirts for the local rugby team, and then the next year you sponsor a hospice, and then the third year you carry on throwing a bit of philanthropy. Is good, of course, but that's not what we're talking about here. The idea of good dividends is what form of social value deeply resonates to our business. And so the stories I've given so far are ones where they've spent some time thinking that through. And what the configurator does, the SDG configurator, is it highlights particular SDGs, particularly SDG targets, that resonate, that the organization can see our purpose is this, that SDG aligns with that purpose, we can create social value in these ways, and the tool sort of identifies it and gives them clarity on that.
Let me then go back to the idea of the 6 dividend areas. Are there particular parts of those, one of those dividends that maybe is more applicable to certain types of business? Or again, do they not really work if you try and separate them out?
They sort of don't work if you separate it out. But everybody I've worked with sees it almost in a list basis. Mm-hmm. So financial, what we could do is we could start with human capital. And once we've sorted human capital out, we'll then look at operational capital. And once we've got operational capital out, now we're getting somewhere. Perhaps we'll look at our reputational capital. And it's almost like, and then once we're really up to speed on this, let's have a look at planet and community and see how it fits. And I can totally get it. Because it feels like the low-hanging fruit is there to be grabbed. Mm-hmm. How can we create employee engagement? Because that will give us productivity, which will improve our product reputation. And boom, we've got more money in the bottom line. It's the same residual perspective. And the difficulty I've had to my failings, not these businesses, but my failings, is trying to communicate a systemic perspective. And I've until the last year, I'd say, I've been pretty poor at communicating that and getting that message across. And it's only when I was traveling on a long journey up to Malik, up near the Isle of Skye, and I had about sort of 4 or 5 hours to think this through because I was being driven. And I came up with this idea of string theory, which has nothing to do with string theory of the physics, but actually instead of an intellectual idea of the good dividends, could I create an experiential moment, a felt sense of, of course, that's what's going on. And we probably don't have the time for me to explain how the game works, but it was just moving from intellectual to felt, a feeling, an emotional sense. That's what a system is. That's what we're avoiding. That's the mistakes we've been making. I get it as a feeling. But I think it's been down to me not communicating it well.
And do you think that the kind of education that we offer on average from business schools, and we would we might put ourselves as being better than that. Do you think the kind of education that youngsters get when they come to learn about management, how to be managers, needs to also get that sense of aha and personal enthusiasm, but also to see the world much more of a system rather than different subject areas?
Yeah, I strongly connect with that, Jan. In a sense, before they arrived, they're imbued with what business is to make profit. That in part the schools are doing that, but in part all their relationships are doing that. They're reinforced in all conversations. The purpose of business is profit. And perhaps that feels like a sort of truism. Of course it is. And the argument we're trying to explore is profit is an enabler. It's something to reinvest in the whole system, and it should grow, so you keep continually reinvesting. And part of the issues of our British economy is we keep withdrawing. It's not reinvesting. So we're worried and fearful of the future, so we withdraw money out, and so the economy shrinks. That's a different topic for a different day. But if we can create a systemic understanding of the flow and how that can occur, it would make a big shift. Let me just make a silly point. I think it's a good point, actually. I don't know why I said a silly point, but a good point, that it's not Adam Smith's fault. Adam Smith, he of The Wealth of Nations.
I agree. So let's redeem Adam Smith. Go for it, Steve.
Thank you. So when he was talking, and it's often spoken about it was the butcher, the baker, and I want to say the candlestick maker, but it was the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, I think. And he said they do not run their businesses in the benevolence so people have a nice healthy meal on their plate. They do it for self-interest. I think it's something like that is the quote. And what the bit that's missing is he wrote this other book, which was his companion, Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was written literally both sides, so he started it and then finished it after The Wealth of Nations, he was basically saying people like to present themselves. People learn how to show off themselves to fit into a society and be well received and well understood in order so they can live out their lives. Now, at the time he was writing The Wealth of Nations, about 1850-ish, it was totally understandable that he would write a phrase in The Wealth of Nations. It's not in the benevolence of those who want to have a nice meal. It's about the residual self-interest. What he was talking about is the mores, the underlying assumptions and principles of a society at that time. And our society has sort of taken that and stuck with it, that we're all about self-interest. And if Adam was about now, hope his ancestors and etc. don't mind me calling him in this sort of first name basis, but if Adam was in the room now on this podcast, I think, I'm not sure he'd give me a high five, but I think he would be on board. He would see the set of systemic challenges that the world faces and understand the necessities of how our society needs to shift and change. He would probably offer to me that it's 50, 60 years too soon, that the assumptions of society haven't changed. I can imagine a world where in 30 to 40 years' time, the systemic challenges of the world are so grave that every pub, every bar, every conversation, every student is engaged in how do we work our way out of this? And I think that will lead to a society where businesses have to have a license in order to operate. And the license will be about in what way do you enhance the planet, enhance society, or at least do not harm the planet at all. And those underlying assumptions will then pervade how we all understand business. Business not about profit, but business is about enhancing humanity.
And what I like about that expression that you did there, I think it's very just to Adam Smith and reading all of his books, not just a wee snippet of one of them, is that it sort of brings us naturally to a bit of a conversation about the benefit corporation. And so this is quite a new approach. I'd like to hear your view about the benefit corporation model, but also how that links to the ideas of good dividends.
So I think benefit corporation is the next step along the journey, where businesses begin to understand themselves and about how their place in society, about what they're seeking to achieve, but also for others, customers, citizens, even politicians and policymakers to begin to understand through what the benefit corporations are trying to do, or the B Corps are trying to do, about different ways business can be understood. So I think they could be an enormous lever. A B Corp, or the original notion of benefit corporation, was established in the States. I'm forgetting, Jan, can you remember which state it was in the United States that created the opportunity or passed a law that a business could have its fiduciary duty, its underlying raison d'etre, why it exists, to be changed. So instead of it must maximize shareholder interest, it would be allowed to have a 50-50 balance. On the one hand, benefit shareholder interest, but on the other hand, have a declared pro-social purpose, a purpose-led reason why that business exists, and therefore have a joint issue on decision-making that in what way, if we pursue this profit orientation, does it allow us to pursue our purpose? So it was on that, my understanding, Jan, it was on that basis that the benefit corporations and B Corp movement was created. And the benefit corporation does encourage people to change their articles of association to look at their fiduciary duty, which is wonderful. But part of our law in the UK hasn't changed to make that so solid. So I think there's a further policy movement that needs to happen there. Now, also along with benefit corporations is there's an accreditation process where you get a badge that you are a B Corp and you've passed test. And it's a pretty rigorous process that takes many, many months, and for some, many years to get through. And I think that's all important to push organisations. And it's broadly about creating transparency, looking at governance, but it does lean, I think it's a journey along the way, but I don't think it goes all the way, because it doesn't see it as a system. It's still working within the frame, because when you fill it in, there's questionnaires and you get to columns and rows and you get to residual answers about what you're good at. And it's more about a compliance, an obligation process. Although nearly all the B Corps I've spoken to are so enthusiastic, they're so engaged in the principle underlying process that the system almost interrupts and gets in the way of it. Because it just sees this compliance orientation that you must do. It doesn't grab the spirit of value creation. It's quite the opposite. So I think it's semi-caught in yesterday's world, but it's the most impressive opportunity. And it overlaps in many of the assessment areas overlap many of the good dividends capitals. Not all of them, but many of them.
Let me ask you this, Steve. You talked a little while ago just about how in 60 years' time, everyone's going to be talking about it, or that everyone's going to be discussing these issues because there's going to be such major problems there. Can there be change without the major problems being there? Is it only when these businesses actually have the major problems right there on their doorstep that are forcing their way through that some of them are actually going to take proper action?
So what runs through my mind is a sense that if we had a different society, so a different way we understand taxation. So our taxation feels high, but it's relatively low compared to Scandinavian countries. So if you had that, where there was significantly greater amount of funding going in to address the community challenges, would we need this argument? Now, I was out in Copenhagen just a couple of weeks ago, working with a group of managers running their businesses. And even in that society where there was much greater finance to address social challenges, the ideas were a different way that they could understand what to do with their business. Mm-hmm. I think the opportunity to shift the business model, the theory of business, to a way in which we maximize all our capitals, and therefore including finance, but also our planet and our communities, should create outperforming businesses. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's old historic evidence that you can look back over the last 10, 20 years that purpose-led businesses outperform the market. And there's various data published on that. So there's a general theme that a neoliberal business, back to your very first question around short-term versus long-term, over the medium to long-term, the data overwhelmingly shows that purpose-led businesses outperform. So just that alone would be a reason to follow the argument we've been exploring. So if we're in a different society, would we still need good dividends? I'm hoping, here's a ridiculous thought, I'm hoping that this is but one idea being thrown into the pot. And I'm hoping, and I've just written a paper going into leadership on this, the journal Leadership, that maybe there would be another 5, 10, 20 ideas better than the good dividends. And those ideas shift society. And society sees business. Here's a point. Society sees business like it sees medicine and law. So if medicine is to health, like law is to justice, I can hear fathers, mothers speaking to their children and saying, you know, the purpose of business is to enable human flourishing. And we might be in an utterly, utterly different world where the sense of purpose permeates all that we do in our businesses rather than just about self-interest.
So Steve, from all your work in good dividends, how optimistic are you and why?
So I am optimistic, but I think it has to get worse before it gets better. I think the narrative, the understanding of how grave the issues are around us, that has to be much more understood more generally, particularly if it's to start shifting policy around government and other people's expectations of the purpose of business. I think that, so things have to get worse before they get better. But I know it can be so different. And I know from the work I've done, there isn't one business, not one in any sector, that can't reframe its understanding of business and reinvest into all of these good dividend areas. Let me give you a final example, if I may, and I'll keep it nameless, but it was a business, a landscaping business, that was on our Good Growth Programme. So all the folks who are on the Good Growth Programme were going, I know exactly who this is. She was on the programme. We got to the stage on the residential where we get into, so what is the purpose of the business? And she was struggling. And so I sat down with her at a moment and said, what is it that you do? Well, basically we throw turf down and it's a pretty competitive situation. So, you know, it's the lowest price gets the result. Not quite the exact words, but that's the feeling, the sense of the story. And I said, well, okay, that's really interesting. Are you familiar with biodiversity net gain? And she said no. I said, well, here's an interesting thing, maybe an opportunity. Biodiversity net gain, new planning system right across the whole UK, actually it's England and Wales, where every site, every developer has to increase the biodiversity from the pre-existing site before they built to the post, once they are finished building, it must be 110%. So there's 10% more biodiversity now on the site than there was before you even started building. The issues then is how do we create more biodiversity now that the client wants, because they are committed to having to realise this, and how can they make that happen? So suddenly the opportunities now exist that instead of just throwing turf down, we're thinking about the maximum ways as part of your everyday work to enhance biodiversity. And so she sort of disappeared off and came back in about 20 minutes later. And she said, it seems strikingly clear to me. The purpose of our business is to maximize and enhance all of our communities so they become flourishing, both us, of the people who buy the houses, of the people who live in the neighbourhoods, of the environment we're all part of. She has now invested in exploring about how to educate the employees about the whole variety of different plants, the different ways they can put pricing and tenders together to maximize biodiversity for their clients. She's inviting school children to come onto the sites to look at what they're doing on biodiversity. She's now engaged with the local college to start exploring different ways they can partner to understand more about biodiversity, to educate the workforce more about biodiversity. So she has shifted what they are doing and the fundamental reason of why they exist in a business, going from it's simply profit to enhancing and enabling flourishing communities. I mean, that gives me great hope.
I've got goosebumps, great big goosebumps, and feel like a little bit, sort of actually caught up in my chest at that story. That is so amazing. What a privilege to get to see that and to enable that, Steve.
Yeah, it is a privilege. And there's, if I may, a book that we're doing coming out called Realising Good Growth in the new year. It's a handbook for business owners, particularly, a whole bunch of tools. So you buy the book, you get all these tools for a year, all for free, digital tools on a website. What's not to like?
But Christmas is coming up.
Her story runs through the whole of the book. It's anonymized. It's turned into a little bit of fiction, so I've exaggerated it to bring in all the arguments of the whole book. But that story runs through the book. And it is a deep privilege to work on these things with businesses. But let me, just before I sign off, make one point that I don't think I've made big time. That all of the stories I've given, all of the opportunities, all of the hope I've spoken to rests on leadership. If those folk in positions of power and influence want to make this happen, it happens. It's nothing more complicated. It's a bit like the phrase, if not you, who, if not now, when. It is that important that leadership see what can happen, and it won't happen without it.
Thank you very much, Steve, for joining us. It's been really good having you here, and it's been really fascinating talking to you about all the stuff to do with good dividends and learning more about that whole concept. Thank you.
Oh, it's been a wonderful time talking about it, and particularly watching your eyebrows going up and down.
I'm going to tip my eyebrows for all future episodes.
So, Paul, even your cynical, cold, dark heart must have been lifted by that conversation.
Thank you, Jen. That's a lovely description of my cold, dark heart. Cynical, I fully accept, but cold, dark heart. My children would love to hear that description of me. Thank you very much. Yeah, Steve does bring a lot of optimism to this conversation. And even when he's being pessimistic about what may or may not happen in the future, he brings in the potential for optimism, saying how if my idea isn't the one, there might be other ideas that are the ones that are just going to help us and make everything better. Yeah, there's a lot of potential optimism. And from the examples he's got of the companies he's worked with and how they get to rethink their purpose and everything that goes on with them, there's a whole lot that's positive there.
The other thing I really liked about how he described what they do is that it's not just working with individual firms, but with firms working together to explore those different models of leadership together, and through that partnership and that inspiration they get from each other, coming to a very different place. And in particular, the mind shifts that his program obtains or takes people through on that journey. So I thought that was also really great to realise that learning is social, and this is a really good example of how that works.
Something we should mention as well is that Steve actually takes a lead role in a program called Good Growth that takes a lot of the aspects of good dividends, and there are good growth programs being run here out of the management school that businesses can take part in. I think there's even one starting in later on at the end of this year. So there are these programs that Steve is able to talk to, much as he described talking to the lady from the landscape gardening company, and how he's able to sort of work with you and figure out how it all works with you. So there's practical impact of this. He's not just sat in a classroom thinking about how it may work. He's going out there and making sure it does work, as is evidenced by all the hundreds of companies he's worked with.
And then the other thing I think he encapsulated so well is that business is to enable flourishing. if that were our predominant mode, then we would be in quite a different place. And so I like that way of framing it as well.
And he has left me with one question totally unrelated to, the heart of the topic is, would Adam Smith be the kind of person to give people a high five?
I really like that Adam came alive and sort of danced around the studio in the background. I don't think in his time high fives probably weren't there. But
this is why we need to bring him into our time. Would he, if he was alive now, have given you a high five, or anyone a high five? He might not have liked you, but he might have liked other people and wanted to give them a high five.
I can't see it, but I wouldn't say it wouldn't happen.
Okay. Well, it sounds like he would have been dancing. So maybe he was more of a dancer. He'd have been on the floors of the pubs and clubs, strutting his stuff and showing off his moves and whatever the kids say nowadays. Maybe he was a breaker. Maybe he was like Ray Gun. That's the kind of person Adam Smith was.
I think we need to stop this conversation because we're going crazy.
Well, I just wanted to mention that, and now I've got in my mind Adam Smith as a breaker in the Olympics. But we'll leave it there, Jan, because we need to start preparing for our next podcast. And we did mention in this podcast about B Corp status, and next time we're going to be talking to representatives from Pentland Brands about how B Corp affects one of their brands, Berghaus. So we're going to be joined by Keisha Gibson, and it's going to be a fascinating conversation, and we better be on our best behaviour because obviously funding for the Pentland Centre comes from an offshoot of Pentland Brands.
Yes, yeah. So, and I know they will also be inspiring. So we'll have 2 inspiring episodes in a row.
Very good. Well, I'd like to think we've had 50-something inspiring episodes in a row, but if you just want to make it 2 and write off everything that we've done before this, fair enough. You just say that, Janet. It makes my life feel dark and worthless like my heart or whatever it was you described me as.
Cold and dark.
Cold and dark, thank you. You've obviously made a note of it. Well, until next time, thank you very much for listening. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Babington.